Hey, what's up guys? This is Hot Boys Garage episode 20. It's been a while since I've done a video, so I figured I'd do one that was kind of easy. Today I'm going to show you how to set and check the valve clearance or valve lash on a first generation Honda TRX450R engine. I'm going to also cover how to check and set your cam timing as well. So again, this video is going to be specific to the first generation TRX450R engines, but most, if not all of it, will still apply to second generation TRX450R engines, as well as a lot of the early CRF450R dirt bike engines. I plan to go into a lot of detail in this video, so it might end up being kind of long, but as always, I'm going to stick kind of like a table of contents down in the video description. That way you can kind of jump around if there's a part that you're not very interested in. Alright, so let's jump into it. The tools you'll need to complete this job are a couple of ratchets and extensions, some metric sockets. I think you only need an 8mm and a 10mm, but an assortment of metric sockets would be best. A couple of box-end metric wrenches might also come in handy. Some Allen wrenches and or some Allen caps, or I think they call these hex sockets, tend to make things easier. A torque wrench, some feeler gauges, either angled or straight, a little magnet, some engine oil for lubrication, red Loctite, pair of needle nose pliers, and some cutters, pen and paper to record your measurements, a decent caliper, a flashlight, some zip ties, and a hot cam shim kit. Isn't necessary, but really makes things easier and quicker, so that you should have on hand the size shim you need without having to go down to the dealership or get online to an OEM parts retailer to order the size shims you need. And also not necessary, but usually comes in handy, a service manual. So with that, let's get to it. First thing we want to do is come around here to the back and remove the seat by pushing up on this latch, which will release the seat, and then you can just pull it off. The next thing I like to do is remove the rear plastics. Now you don't need to do this, but it just makes it a little bit easier to get in and work on stuff. First thing we'll do is pull the kicker out of the way. And then on the left and right side of the bike, we'll remove a total of 6 bolts. 3 over here, 3 over here. First one's here on top, and the other 2 are down underneath. 1 here and 1 down here. And all 6 of those are a 10mm head. Next, we'll come back up top and pull the tabs out of these rubber grommets here. Then 1 on the right side and 1 on the left side. And then you should just be able to pick your plastics up off the bike, set them aside, and now we'll remove the gas tank. So first step in removing the gas tank, you'll need to remove 4 bolts total for the front plastics, 1 here and 1 here on both sides. And then once you've got these 2 bolts removed, pull this guy back, and you'll need to remove this bolt. There's 2 bolts total, 1 on each side, which hold the gas tank to the frame. And all of these, the bolts for the plastics and the bolts here that hold the tank to the frame, all have an 8mm head. Next, we'll come up and pull the breather out of its home so it's free. The next step will be to remove the straps, if you've still got them, that run from here on the back of the gas tank down to the frame. Not sure if you can see it here, but there's little tabs on the frame that the straps will run down to and hook onto. I find it easiest to remove the straps from the frame, leave them dangling on the back of the gas tank. There's 1 on each side, so remove both of those. Come over here to the fuel petcock, turn it sideways to turn it off, and that will leave some gas in the line. So if you go ahead and pull that off now, you might get a little bit of gas all over yourself or the bike. So if you don't want that to happen, you can come down and drain the carburetor, stick a bowl under the bike, and this is an FCR carburetor, but even on the stock one, there'll be a drain bolt here at the bottom of the carb bowl that you can screw out with a flathead screwdriver, and that'll drain all the gas out of the bowl and the line here. Just make sure you turn your petcock off first, or else it'll keep draining all the fuel out of your tank. And after that, the last thing we need to do is remove the line from the petcock's fuel outlet here. This is an aftermarket line. The stocks look kind of like an S. So you'll need to loosen up the clamp. A lot of times, I think the OEM clamp looks like this. Just take and squeeze it together with a pair of needle nose pliers and slip it back. That way it's free, and then you can just pull the hose off. Then with that, you should be able to just lift your gas tank off of the bike, set it aside, and it'll leave you with something that looks like this. Alright, next step will be to remove this heat shield, and it's usually just held on by 3 little plastic grommets. 1 will be here, 1 will be here on the other side, and 1 will be down here, and it'll be attached to the radiator antifreeze overflow tank. Those plastic push buttons will look like this. Just get in underneath the center, pop the center up, and then get underneath the other piece, flathead screwdriver, and they'll pop right out. So 3 total, remove those. You come up and pull the throttle cable out of its home here. And then on the other side, you'll need to pull the hot start cable up and out of its home, as well as work the wiring harness out from underneath all the tabs. Keep it in place. With everything freed up and out of there, you kind of need to pop this guy up and out. And what I usually do is take this front, pull it over, push it up, and then back here, I'll work this stuff over out of the way. You'll have to take it up and over the valve cover, under all this stuff, and out the side. So with that off, you now have access to the top of the valve cover, and it'll look like this. What I usually do is zip tie the hot start cable and wiring harness out of the way over here, and also zip tie the throttle cable over here and out of the way. Then we can take and pull off the spark plug cap, the coil cap, and then we'll pull off this little guy. You can usually get it with your fingers. If not, needle nose pliers. Pull off the valve cover breather. Kind of stick it back out of the way. After that, we'll loosen and remove these 3 bolts here. If yours are stock, they should be 10 millimeter. And when you're removing these, just be aware that underneath each one, there's a small little rubber gasket underneath there. All 3 bolts removed, we can go ahead and lift the valve cover up and off the engine. A couple of things to watch out for when you remove the valve cover. There are 2 gaskets. One's around the spark plug tower. Sometimes it stays in the valve cover. Sometimes it stays on the spark plug tower itself. And then there's also a thin rubber gasket around the bottom of the valve cover. And again, sometimes it stays on the valve cover, sometimes it stays on the head. Quick and dirty way of doing this, if you don't want to verify your cam timing, you just want to pull your crank check hole plug, which is kind of what this is simulating. And you want to rotate your engine over to about top dead center, which is your intake lobes facing back and slightly up without the decompressor arm engaged. So that looks kind of like this. Notice what the intake lobes look like, and our decompressor arm is not engaged. Now we have to set the engine to top dead center. And to do that, you've got to remove 2 check hole caps. One is over here on the left-hand side, the flywheel side. It's this guy right here. It's the flywheel check hole cap. It takes a 6 millimeter Allen. You'll remove that. And then you'll come over to the right-hand side of the bike, or the clutch side, and there will be a crank check hole cap here that you remove. This bike here is set up for an external remote starter, so it's going to look quite a bit different than yours. But I'll stick pictures of what a stock right side cover looks like and that crank check hole that you'll remove. And then also here's another picture with the crank check hole cap removed, and you can see the bolt in there that is directly attached to the crank. And you'll need to put an 8 millimeter Allen on a ratchet and use that bolt, turning it counterclockwise to rotate the engine over to where it needs to be. So it's pretty much going to simulate the same thing that I'm doing here. As I rotate this bolt, the engine turns over. So now you should have your crank check hole cap removed. You should have your ratchet through the crank check hole and in the crank bolt, ready to turn it over, and your flywheel check hole cap should be removed. So now what we want to do is rotate the engine over using our ratchet and look down in this check hole, and you'll notice you can see the flywheel down in there, and you'll also notice that there is a slit in the threads there, and that's what we're going to use to line up. There's a mark on the flywheel that we're looking for with a little T next to it, and it's super hard to see through this little tiny hole, so I'd recommend getting a flashlight and shining it down in here as you turn the engine over very slowly. So I'll stick a picture of what that T looks like on the flywheel with this stator cover and the flywheel removed, just so you can kind of see what you're looking for. And a lot of times when I have an engine apart, I'll use a white paint marker and put a white stripe on the flywheel right there at that T mark, so it's really easy to see. So as I rotate this engine over, should be able to see that white mark pop up. There it is. So we want to line up that white mark that I painted over the timing mark. I'm going to line that up with the slit in the threads of the hole. So once you've got that lined up, you should be able to come back up here to the top of the engine, and you can see the intake lobes should be pointed back and slightly up. So now you're at top dead center, and it's good to go ahead and verify that your cam timing is correct. So now that we're at top dead center, we need to come down here below the left side of the frame, and this is going to be kind of hard to see on camera, but there are 2 hash marks on the cam sprocket. One here, and there's one on the other side, which is really hard to see because of the frame. Right there it is. And there there are, on a stock cam carrier, there are 2 marks on the cam carrier that you need to line up those hash marks on the cam sprocket with on both sides. Now, it's really hard to do with the engine and the frame, that is lining up both of them. So what I normally do is I just use the front one here, because if you get down, and they have to be lined up with your eye level. You can't be looking from the top down or from the bottom up. The marks have to line up with your eye level. As you can see on this billet cam carrier, I put a mark back there to simulate the arrow that comes on a stock cam carrier, because the billet ones don't really come with anything. And I'll stick a picture of what that looks like in the video now. So now we're all good. Engine's atop dead center. We verified already that our cam timing is correct. Now we can check our valve lash, or our valve clearances. So to check the intake valve clearances, you're going to take a feeler gauge, and it can be straight or angled or whatever you can get the most accurate feel with. And you're going to take the feeler gauge and slip it between the base circle of the cam and the top of the intake bucket. So I usually try and start with feeler gauge that pretty sure is going to be too big to fit. This is a 7/1000 feeler gauge, so I'll try to slip it in here between the base circle of the left intake lobe and the top of the left intake bucket, and it won't go. And then I'm going to do the same thing over here between the right intake lobe and the right intake bucket, and it also will not go. I tried the same thing with the 6/1000 feeler gauge. It wouldn't quite go, and now I'm down to the 5/1000 feeler gauge, and so this one will slip in between, and it's not too tight. There's a bit of resistance there, slip in without any issue, and so that's what you want to shoot for. So 5/1000 is my clearance on the left intake side, and on the right intake side we also have 5/1000 clearance. Now again, you want a nice feeling of slight resistance here. You don't want it to be too loose, so 5/1000 here is just perfect. So that's our clearance. Here's hopefully a better shot of what the cam lobe and bucket and feeler gauge situation should look like. I know it probably wasn't the easiest to see with the camera on the tripod, but here's what you're looking for. Okay, next we'll check the exhaust valve clearances. And to do that, you'll use your feeler gauges to check the gap here between the top of the exhaust valve shim and the bottom of the rocker. So again, I started with something that I knew was going to be way too big, like a 12/1000 feeler gauge. I knew that wouldn't fit. I'm now down to a 9/1000 feeler gauge. I can do this on camera. It'll go in, but there's just a bit too much resistance there. Now I'll try an 8/1000 feeler gauge. That'll go in. It's got a slight bit of resistance. And so this exhaust valve is set at 8/1000 right now. So it's going to need to be adjusted. And so just like with the intake valve clearances, here's another look with some light on what checking the exhaust valve clearances should look like. Feeler between the exhaust rocker arm, the top of the exhaust valve shim. And I'd recommend going ahead and writing everything down. That way you can keep track of it. So now, if your valve clearances were in spec, this is as far as you need to go. You can stick your valve cover back on, torque the bolts to 7 foot-pounds, and reverse your steps. Put everything back on the bike. But if you do need to adjust your valves and get the clearances within spec, we'll move forward with that. The first thing we're going to need to do is loosen, but not yet remove, the 2 cam sprocket bolts. One there, and one down there. It's important to note at this point, if you have an adjustable cam gear or a slotted stock cam flange, you want to make sure that you mark or scribe where the cam sprocket is in relation to the cam flange. And most builders, most assemblers will already have this mark, but this is an important note. Doing this with the engine in the frame makes this step a little bit tricky. We'll have to loosen one bolt at a time, and you'll have to rotate each bolt down to the bottom here where you can get your Allen cap in to loosen it. For the first bolt, you put your Allen cap in, and with another ratchet over on the right side of the bike, using that same bolt that's connected to the crankshaft, you're going to want to set that ratchet to counterclockwise and use that bolt to hold the engine in place while you break this bolt loose. And they can be pretty tight, and they should have red Loctite on them, so they might be kind of difficult to break loose. I don't recommend using an impact on these Allen cap bolts because they're a lot more likely to wallow out and strip out. So go ahead and loosen this one up. Just a few turns, but don't take it all the way out yet. Then you'll remove the ratchet, turn your other ratchet that's in the crank bolt back to clockwise, turn the engine over until the other bolt is now at the bottom where you can get your ratchet in between the head and the frame to loosen it. So turn your other ratchet that's on the crank bolt back to counterclockwise and loosen this. And for this one, you can go ahead and take it all the way out. Just be careful not to drop it down inside the engine. With that one all the way out, go ahead and set the ratchet that you've got in the crank bolt back to clockwise and turn the engine over to where that original bolt is back on the bottom to where you can get in there with the ratchet. And leave it like that for right now. Before we go any further, if you don't want to have to worry about fishing the cam chain out and trying to completely reset timing, what you can do is take some zip ties, put them through the cam sprocket and around the cam chain, and tighten them down. And that will keep the chain where it is on the cam sprocket. Before we remove that last cam sprocket bolt, I like to go ahead and remove the cam chain tensioner, which is here on the back of the cylinder. So this one is a custom manual chain tensioner. It's not an OEM one that's like automatically adjusting. But they're held on kind of the same way. There are just 2 bolts here in the back, one on the bottom, one up top. You just remove those bolts slowly, alternating back and forth, because there is a tensioner in here kind of pushing back on those bolts. So you don't want to back one bolt all the way out and leave one bolt all the way in. That's a good way to strip threads. And just note, this thing does have a gasket with it as well. You'll want to make sure that's in good shape whenever you reinstall it. All right, now that we've got our cam chain tensioner removed, we can remove this last cam sprocket bolt. So you can back it out and remove it while kind of holding the cam sprocket onto the cam flange and making sure you don't drop this bolt down inside the engine. Pull it off, set it aside. And here again, if you want to try and not have to worry too much about resetting cam timing, you can pull the cam sprocket and chain off all at once while kind of holding some pressure up on it. You can slip a zip tie through the cam sprocket up and around the frame and effectively zip tie the cam sprocket, cam chain, all as one unit to the frame. So here's what that kind of looks like from the left side of the bike and coming up from the top down. And then here's what that kind of looks like from the right side of the bike. And again, this just kind of saves a step on reassembly, makes it a little bit easier to get your timing set back in the right place. Now, this doesn't guarantee that your timing is going to be exactly correct when you go to reassemble, because there's also a sprocket down on the crank for this chain to ride on, and it could slip or move around in this whole removal process and trying to zip tie it with some pressure up to keep it on down inside the cases. So I always recommend rechecking your cam timing anytime you remove the cam sprocket from the cam, and we'll go over how to do that whenever we reassemble. Okay, now we've got our cam sprocket off. You should have your tensioner removed, and the only thing holding this entire cam carrier assembly in are these 4 bolts. If yours are stock, they should be 10 millimeter. So we'll go ahead and loosen them up little by little in a crisscross pattern and remove them. With those 4 bolts removed, you should be able to wiggle the cam carrier assembly side to side and slowly and gently lift it up. Now the rocker arm is going to kind of want to fall down. You can hold it up. I don't know if you can hear that on the camera, but one of the shims just fell. You want to kind of keep the cam carrier over to the right, because a lot of times the shims will want to either fall out or stick up inside here. See, that one is still in there, and the other intake shim actually fell out onto the head. So it's important to try not to let them fall down into the engine through the timing chain hole, and you want to keep track of which valve they came from. With the cam carrier assembly removed, your engine should look like this. Yeah, most of the time the intake shims will come out with the buckets, or they'll fall out onto the head, and a lot of times the exhaust valve shims will stay in place. And to get them out, I usually just use like a little magnet like this, stick it on there and pull it out. Once you've got your valve shims out, you might want to measure them or know what thickness they are. Now, a lot of times, both with like OEM Honda and the Hott cam shims, their sizes will be like stamped or laser engraved right on them. And depending on how old they are, you might be able to read them. Like this Hott cam shim is a 1.95 millimeter. But if you can't read what size it is on the shim itself, this is where a caliper comes in handy. You can gently clamp it between the caliper jaws and see what thickness the shim is. And as always, I recommend writing everything down. That way you don't forget it, and you can easily calculate the size shims you need to go back in to get you within spec. Now, since we know what our valve clearance is and how thick our current shims are, we can do a couple quick calculations to figure out what size shims need to go back in to get our valve clearances within spec. So I've got the board up here to illustrate some of this. So the first thing we need to know is what is the valve clearance spec for the cam we've got in. So I've got these the stock TRX450R cams valve clearance specs up here on the board. Intake clearance of 6 thousandths plus or minus 1 thousandth of an inch, and the exhaust clearance of 11 thousandths plus or minus 1 thousandth of an inch. And again, valve clearance spec is going to vary by the cam, so you need to consult your cam card or your cam manufacturer. So for example, if we've got a stock cam in which has a valve clearance spec of 6 thousandths plus or minus 1 thousandth of an inch, that means if our intake clearance came in between 5 thousandths and 7 thousandths of an inch, we're good to go on the intake valves. Likewise, if our exhaust clearance came in between 10 thousandths of an inch and 12 thousandths of an inch, then we're good to go. We can put the same size shims back in and we'll be in spec. Now I'll go over some mock measurements with the shim sizes so we can calculate together what size shims we need to stick back into the engine to get our valve clearances back into spec. A couple of caveats first. So there's kind of some weirdness with owning a Japanese made engine in the US, and that is, in the US, a lot of our tools such as feeler gauges are in SAE or units of measure that is standard, and for this our feeler gauges are in inch or thousandths of an inch. And then most, if not all, of the 9.48 millimeter diameter shims, their thicknesses are measured in millimeters, which is metric. So an important conversion to note is that each 1,000th of an inch is equal to 0.0254 millimeters. And again, we'll go over some measurements up here, but if you want a plug and play type calculator, there is a site called crfsonly.com. They actually have a valve shim calculator where you can just plug everything in, your measurements, your shim thicknesses, and it'll spit out what new shim thickness you'll need. And I'll stick the link to that calculator in the video description. But if you want to do it manually with me, here we go. So let's say our left intake valve measured at 4 thousandths of an inch, which is smaller than our spec intake clearance of between 5 and 7 thousandths of an inch. So this 4 thousandths of an inch means our gap needs to be larger. So our current 3.05 millimeter shim is too large. So that leads me to select the 3.00 millimeter shim, which should put our left intake clearance at 6 thousandths of an inch, which is within spec. Our right intake valve measured at 5 thousandths of an inch with a 3.0 millimeter shim. So that same 3.00 millimeter shim is gonna go back into the right intake valve. Next, we've got our left exhaust valve. It measured at 13 thousandths of an inch with a 2.25 millimeter shim. If we look up here at our exhaust clearance spec between 10 and 12 thousandths, that 13 thousandths is too large. So we're actually going to need a thicker or larger shim to get us back into spec. So for that, I would select a 2.30 millimeter shim, which should put us at 11 thousandths of an inch valve clearance. And then lastly, our right exhaust valve measured at 10 thousandths of an inch with a 2.15 millimeter shim, which is within spec. So that same 2.15 millimeter shim is going to go back in that valve. And that's pretty much all there is to it in calculating your valve shim sizes. Once you've got the correct valve shims picked out, set each of the 4 down inside the valve spring keepers. I recommend putting a light coat of oil on them and checking to make sure each of them are seated properly down in the keepers. Next, you'll take your cam and carrier assembly and make sure the buckets are up inside of the bores of the cam carrier assembly. Also, make sure the cam carrier dowels are in place, either in the cam carrier, shown here, or on top of the cylinder head, shown here. Next, you'll take the cam carrier assembly, and while you're holding the exhaust rocker arm up and ensuring the cam's intake lobes are facing back and slightly up, you'll slide the carrier into place. Now, you might have to wiggle it a little bit to get it to set down on the dowels or to get the dowels to set down in the head, but this is what it should look like. Next, you'll reinstall the 4 cam carrier bolts. The long ones go in the front, the short ones go in the back, and you'll tighten those in a crisscross pattern to a torque spec of 10 foot-pounds. Now at this point, I would recommend going ahead and rechecking all 4 of your valve clearances just to double check that all your shims are the correct size. Next, you'll take and cut the zip ties that you use to hold the cam chain and cam flange to the frame and slip it back up onto the cam flange like this. Now you want to put a dab of red Loctite on each of the cam sprocket bolts. Next, take one of those cam sprocket bolts and get it started on the bottom hole of the cam sprocket. Next, go ahead and snug that one bolt up, but don't torque it all the way yet. At this point, if you've got an adjustable cam gear or a slotted cam gear, this is where you really need to make sure that the marks from the cam gear line up with the marks on the cam flange. With one of the cam sprocket bolts already in, we'll go ahead and reinsert our cam chain tensioner, making sure that our gasket is there and in good shape. And we'll snug up and tighten each bolt, alternating top to bottom, to make sure we don't strip any threads. Now we'll go ahead and go over to the right side of the bike, and with our ratchet that's on the crank bolt, we'll rotate it counterclockwise until we can get to the other cam sprocket bolt. Once you're able to get your Allen cap in there, go ahead and put the cam sprocket bolt in with some red Loctite and torque this one to spec. And while you torque it, you'll have to reverse the ratchet on the right side of the bike that's in the crank bolt to hold the engine. Next, rotate the engine back around to where you can get to the original cam sprocket bolt and torque it to spec in the same fashion. So at this point, if you haven't already, this is another really good place to go ahead and double check your cam timing to make sure it is dead on. First, you want to rotate your engine around just like we did before and line up that slit in the flywheel check hole with the T mark on the flywheel. And if you missed that initially, you can go ahead and rewind the video. And at this point, your cam lobes should be facing back and slightly up, and with your eye level to the cam sprocket hash mark and the cam carrier arrow, everything should line up. And if it doesn't, you'll need to first remove your cam chain tensioner and then remove your cam sprocket bolts. Pull the sprocket and chain off. Rotate the sprocket inside the chain one way or the other, whichever way you're off. Set the sprocket back on the cam flange and repeat the steps. If you want to set or adjust your decompressor arm, now would be a good time to do it. It's located on the right exhaust valve here, and you can set it with a feeler between the decompressor arm screw and the top of the exhaust rocker with a feeler gauge like I'm showing here, and I'll put the clearance specs in the video now. Or you can set it with a compression gauge. And for that, you'll need a compression tester, you'll need to remove the spark plug, and you'll need to kick the bike over or use your electronic start, depending on the year, to get a reading for that. And I'll also stick the recommended pressure readings for each year in the video now. To adjust your decompressor, you'll need to loosen the lock nut, holding the decompressor screw onto the decompressor arm, and screw it in or out. Just make sure you tighten the decompressor nut back up. Next, you can put your valve cover back on. Make sure the valve cover gasket is in good shape, as well as the spark plug tower gasket. Make sure all of your valve cover bolt gaskets are in place and in good shape. Put your 3 valve cover bolts back in and torque them to 7 foot-pounds. Make sure you reinstall your flywheel check hole cap as well as your crank check hole cap. Put the spark plug cap back onto the spark plug. Reinstall your valve cover breather and pretty much reverse your steps from here. Put everything back on the way that you found it. Thanks for watching the video. Hope it was helpful. I hope you learned something. If you like the content, subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and as always, in between videos, you can find me on Facebook and Instagram. You can search for Hot Boys Racing on both of those, but I'll stick both of the links in the video description. And until next time, thanks for watching.